Binding vows, or as the Viz team likes to call them, pacts, are essentially just the ability to make a deal with someone using Jujutsu like a legal contract to ensure that a certain agreed upon goal is met. When speaking of binding vows, there are usually two types of binding vows. There are the self-imposed binding vows, which are usually used to give up something of your own in exchange for strengthening a different one of your qualities. These can even be unintentionally made, like how an open barrier domain usually has a far bigger maximum range than a closed one, because open barrier domains allow their opponents to escape, which is disadvantageous, so you gain more effective range in exchange. Another automatic or unintentional binding vow is how when you explain your curse technique to your opponent, it becomes more effective in exchange. The fans have dubbed this the revealing one's hand binding vow. Since opponents usually have no reason to explain their abilities to each other, they could use that to try and land a bunch of cheap blows. But if your ability becomes more effective by revealing it, it suddenly creates a reason for characters to want to explain their techniques. Low-key, it's also just a really clever writing tool that Gege Akutami uses to allow characters to explain their abilities to the audience without losing their suspension of disbelief. An example of an intentional self-imposed binding vow would be like Nanami's overtime. Here Nanami limits his maximum amount of cursed energy that can be used and outputted during work hours to around 80 to 90%. If he's still working after those quote-unquote regular hours, he'll regain access to his actual cursed energy limits, and the cursed energy that was limited from use during work hours will be added on to his actual limit, resulting in a significant boost in performance. According to the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook, this boost is around 110 to 120% depending on how much he held back during work hours that day. Now, when it comes to making a binding vow with yourself, there's no outside party determining the value. The pacts might seem reasonable to us as readers, but in universe, who says so? I think that this is one of the first mysteries of binding vows. Because if it simply is that the sorcerer has to believe that it's reasonable, then it would open up an entire realm of possibilities of untapped potential. Like, say if Gojo really felt like he needed his 6 eyes to navigate the world, and he made a binding vow that for 1 second in battle they'd shut down after saying a certain phrase. Then he could, if he finds it reasonable enough of course, gain some incredibly powerful boost in return. Or like Hakari intentionally stalling a jackpot in a dire situation, only to land it again on the very next roll, except now gaining a longer jackpot timer. The other option is that there's either some other godly authority determining if it's reasonable, or that every sorcerer has an innate feeling, like a sixth sense for binding vows determining it, so that the instant the sorcerer thinks of any given binding vow, they just know if it's reasonable. I'm personally leaning more towards the idea that sorcerers just need to believe in it themselves. My reason for this is that Hakari's body with full cursed energy reserves after landing a jackpot wasn't durable enough to block a single one of Kashimo's lightning bolts. Yet when he gave up his arm, thus losing the ability to cast the domain again, that energy was suddenly enough to make him durable enough to survive an explosion of lightning blasts. Credit goes to BusinessGlad4188 on Reddit for the idea of this mystery. Coming back to the two types of binding vows, the second type are the binding vows between 2 or more parties, which are most commonly used when trading goods or services. Making a deal with someone who is a Jujutsu practitioner doesn't inherently mean that it's a binding vow. When making a binding vow with someone else, you have to actually specify that you and the other party are entering into a pact. A good example of this is how Mimiko and Nanako agreed to help Kenjaku until the enacting of the Shibuya incident if Kenjaku returned Suguru Geto's body to them. What ended up happening was that Kenjaku was just able to ignore this deal without any repercussions, since they never actually specified into entering a binding vow. Something else of note is that if a binding vow is created to grant a service for one party, the other party does have the option to willingly reject the payment afterwards. Doing this ends the pact. Such was the case at the end of Volume 0, where Yuta made a binding vow with the Queen of Curses Rika that he would give up his own life and join her in the afterlife, in exchange for Rika gaining more power to beat Geto. However, after Rika kept up her end of the deal, she didn't want Yuta to keep up his end, because she was content with getting a few extra years of life by living as a curse, and so the binding vow was successfully terminated. Now this next part is unconfirmed, but it might be that if an outside party tries to interfere with what was stipulated in a binding vow, that you might be forced to try and stop that outside party from interfering. What I'm referring to specifically is that Hakari made a pact with Kashimo that in exchange for his points and support, that Kashimo would get to fight Ryoma and Sukuna. Now, as Kashimo's about to fight Sukuna and finally get his end of the bargain, it looks like Uraume was about to interfere. Hakari then immediately jumps Uraume with a domain expansion to stall their arrival and let Kashimo get his fight. It might be that if Kashimo died without getting to fight Sukuna, that Hakari technically broke their binding vow, and thus he had to play a sort of facilitator role in making sure that Kashimo got what was agreed upon. Lastly, when making binding vows with 2 or more parties, multiple people can happen to be in a single party. Even cursed spirits can enter into these types of binding vows if they're conscious enough to understand that they're entering one. Another recent example in the anime being that Mekamaru was the mole providing information to one of the higher-ups for Kenjaku and Mahito, as long as they don't hurt any of the Kyoto students. And in exchange, Mahito provides the service of reshaping Kokichi Muta's body to what he'd have actually been if he weren't affected by Heavenly Restriction. Speaking of Heavenly Restriction, did you know that Heavenly Restriction is also a form of a binding vow? Kenjaku alludes to as much, and it functions on the same basis of gain and loss. Furthermore, the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook solidifies it too. Roughly translated and keeping the Viz terminology in mind, the passage goes, "A binding that is forced on the body at birth is called a heavenly restriction, and in exchange for that restriction, powerful effects can be obtained." We know that binding refers to binding vow, since in the manga the term shibari is used for binding vows, and is once again used here. Heavenly restriction operating on a basis of equivalent exchange or gain and loss means that the reward you get out of it is only as valuable as what you gave up to get it. In the case of Toji and Maki Zenin, they lose the ability to generate cursed energy altogether, and in exchange gain a physically gifted body. In the case of Kokichi Muta, he loses most of his bodily autonomy in exchange for gaining a far greater range at which he can perfectly control his cursed energy, and his ceiling for cursed energy output is drastically boosted as well. It's not explained how someone gains a heavenly restriction, so it's unknown if it's self-imposed or created with a secondary party. What's so mysterious about heavenly restriction is that if it were self-imposed, you could basically give it up in exchange for losing the thing that you gained. Kenjaku even says that that much is possible to Mahito. Not only that, but if it were self-imposed, you could basically make all the regular humans do it, and they'd stop generating cursed spirits like Yuki and Geto wanted. Yet it appears to be much more complicated than that. Especially when you consider that there were more physically gifted heavenly restriction users in the past, but Toji was the first ever to have 0 cursed energy instead of low or small amounts of cursed energy. So are heavenly restrictions then binding vows with multiple parties involved? Personally, I'm leaning towards no. In chapter 11, while inside of his innate domain, Sukuna makes it clear to Yuji that it is impossible to force someone into a binding vow. They have to willingly agree to it, and since heavenly restrictions are usually placed onto babies at birth, it would seem strange to me that a baby would have the ability to consent to putting themselves under heavenly restriction. Secondly, if a binding vow involves giving up something for another, what would this secondary party gain or lose from putting someone else under heavenly restriction? The only thing that I can think of is that they'd have to exchange their life, and in exchange, the baby would be put under heavenly restriction for the rest of their life. But this is still missing the consent element. The other part about binding vows that's so mysterious to me is that we still don't know what happens when you break one. For the self-imposed binding vows, it's pretty simple. Whatever you gave up, you now regain, and you lose whatever you initially gained in exchange, essentially resetting everything to before the self-imposed binding vow was created. But for the binding vows regarding multiple parties, it's a lot more complicated. Kenjaku says that you can indeed have the prior mentioned things happen, but that there is a far greater penalty for breaking one that even he doesn't know about. Personally, I think that Kenjaku does know, but that he was simply withholding this information from Mahito for his own personal benefit. But clearly there must be some truth to what he is saying, because even Sukuna, the king of curses himself, is afraid of the penalty of breaking a binding vow, as he does his absolute best not to break the conditions of his enchained binding vow with Yuji. And though Kenjaku and Sukuna aren't necessarily the best of friends, Sukuna does allow Kenjaku to stick around with him for protection. Most likely for the service that Kenjaku provided for Sukuna 1,000 years ago when he split his soul into the 20 fingers. So just what is it that makes it so scary to break a binding vow? What could the consequences possibly be that even Ryomen Sukuna himself is afraid to such a degree? I do hope that we get some answers to this at some point in the story. Initially, I thought that Yuji being forced to forget about the enchained binding vow would make him instinctually resist allowing Sukuna to take over, and thus breaking the binding vow in the process. I thought that we'd get to see the consequences here, and that would be how Sukuna freed himself from Yuji. What we got instead was that Sukuna found a loophole in the specific wording, allowing him to free himself from Yuji. Perhaps it could be that once you agree into a binding vow with someone, that you physically cannot break it. This would explain how Yuji actually couldn't resist Sukuna coming out with Enchain when he normally can. It would explain how Yuji lost any recollection of the binding vow being made, yet he specifically remembered to not be allowed to resist Sukuna at the moment of the chant. Lastly, it would also explain why Heavenly Restriction users can't quote-unquote break their pact, because they are compelled to be physically unable to break the pact. In other words, the consequence from breaking a binding vow is that you aren't able to break it in the first place. Actually guys, I lied. Earlier I said that the consequences of breaking a binding vow with yourself is that you only lose what was gained. But during the editing of this video, chapter 244 came out. In this chapter, we were told that a long time ago we were actually introduced to a new type of binding vow. See, at the end of the Shibuya incident, Kasumi Miwa tries to slice Kenjaku with her sword, and Kenjaku easily manages to block it with his bare hands. During that slash, Miwa talks about giving it her all, even if it means she could never swing a katana again. Initially, I and most other fans thought that she just meant that she was physically overexerting herself, as in that she would swing so hard that she could possibly tear a muscle or so, resulting in her not being able to wield a katana anymore. But it actually turns out that Miwa made a binding vow with herself during that moment to try and boost her power, meaning that from that point onward, she isn't allowed to wield a katana. From this I can discern that there are two types of self-imposed binding vows. The first being ones where you initially give up something now and get your reward later, and the other being where you get the reward first and then have to give up something later. Seeing as that we know for a fact that the self-imposed binding vows where you give up something first work on equivalent exchange, it could very well be that self-imposed binding vows where you get your reward first are way weaker, since the binding technically has no way to know what would be an equivalent reward, seeing as you could just break it at any time after, right? Furthermore, this now brings up the problem of what happens when you break the vow. Technically speaking, if you were to apply the rule that breaking self-imposed binding vows don't result in a penalty, what is stopping Miwa from just grabbing a katana again? Does time rewind and whatever boost you got at that point disappear? Or do you suffer a sort of penalty after all? The only thing that us getting this Miwa explanation in chapter 244 did was create even more questions. Coming back to the conversation that Kenjaku had with Mahito, the way how some people interpreted what Kenjaku says is that the consequences for breaking a binding vow may be grave, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to happen instantly. Meaning that there could be a possibility that the consequences for breaking a binding vow could happen right now, it could happen later today, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week, or it could happen in a couple of years. I also think that it was really interesting how Kenjaku made binding vows with a bunch of different cursed spirits to get them to enter his culling game. And then as soon as he gained Geto's body, he was able to use cursed spirit manipulation to force them into nulling their vows. Meaning that even though you can't force someone to enter a pact, it is possible to force them to exit it if your curse technique allows for it. But what do you guys think? Do you think that the mysteries behind the mechanics of binding vows will ever be fully explained? And what do you guys think could be some possible answers or explanations to the mysteries I presented in this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you like this type of content, please be sure to comment, like, subscribe, as more content is on the way. Your support is always much appreciated. See ya!